As I start the message part of the service, I just want to quickly mention that we had recorded a beautiful sermon in the chapel and was ready to go. And then when I reviewed it, the windows of the chapel made the autofocus of the camera sort of go off. And I came out looking like a VHS recording from 1988. So I decided I am going to do my message from my office on my computer camera. It's a little bit different, but hopefully the message will be more clear and more enjoyable to you. So last summer, if you were around, and you may or may not remember, Pastor David had started a series on the 7 deadly sins. And I was invited to preach on 2 of them, anger and envy. And as Pastor Michael this summer invited me to preach this month, I thought, it might be interesting to visit the opposite of the sins and look at the 7 virtues. And so since I only have 4 Sundays, even though there are 7 virtues, I am only going to look at the 4 cardinal virtues. And the 4 cardinal virtues are fortitude, temperance, justice, and prudence, using simpler words, sort of strength or courage, a justice, doing what's right, prudence, wisdom, and temperance, which is self-control. And so each week I'm going to look at the lectionary lesson, the lectionary scriptures, and sort of look at them through the focus of one of the virtues as kind of a lens. And this week, I thought I would use the virtue of fortitude. And so fortitude comes from sort of an ancient philosophy that, in fact, all of the cardinal virtues come from ancient philosophy, like Plato and Aristotle and Cicero, and they come filtered to us through the Christian philosophers like Augustine, Thomas Aquinas, and Ambrose. And they represent actions that we do which bring goodness and wholeness into our lives. Now, the other virtues, the theological virtues, are faith, hope, and love, and those are gifts from God. But the cardinal virtues are actions, things that we should do in order to promote the good and to be able to experience the fullness of God genuinely. So fortitude, like I said, has been translated as courage, forbearance, strength, endurance, the ability to confront fear, uncertainty, or intimidation. It sort of means all of those things. And so when we limit it to one of those words, it sort of limits our understanding of what fortitude really is. Now, as I mentioned, Augustine is one of the philosophers, Christian philosophers, and Augustine sort of summed up fortitude in being that fortitude is love, readily enduring and bearing all things for the sake of that which is loved. So fortitude bears and endures all things for the sake of something which is loved or someone which is loved. And so we need to clarify what the difference is between, let's say, fortitude and stubbornness or selfishness. What happens sometimes is virtues can be corrupted by sin. And so if we're looking at the classical 7 deadly sins and we take a sin like pride, and we mix it with fortitude, what happens is we get sort of this narcissism, this sort of persistent pride that covers everything, and the absorption of the self. Or if we mix um, fortitude with envy, what happens is we get hatred and suspicion. We get the loathing of our neighbors and of people that we don't know, of strangers, and we bear them grudges for attempting success, because it's sort of a theology of scarcity, that if you have something, I'm losing something. And then if we take um, fortitude and mix it with something like a sin like greed, it becomes this sort of persistent desire to accumulate wealth or possessions. It's sort of this robber mentality of, I am going to get financial success at the cost of anything. So we need to really be careful that virtue stays virtuous and that it doesn't devolve into something like selfishness and pettiness. So, with that said, let us look how fortitude plays into our scripture readings. Our first experience of scripture today is in the call to worship. It's from the Song of Solomon, and the Song of Solomon isn't used very much in church. In fact, one of the reasons why I love this cycle of the lectionary is that the Song of Solomon is used. We occasionally hear the Song of Solomon during weddings, but most of the time it's shied away from because it is so passionate, it's carnal, and sometimes its themes are thought of as like, why is this in church? But what it does is it talks in very realistic human terms of a passionate love between God and humanity. It's a longing, it's a love which endures. It's like that love that Augustine talks about, a love that forbears everything and anything for the sake of another. This isn't a one night stand, and it's not a summer fling. This is a long term, trusting, relational love that's not only relational, but reciprocal. And so that forms the foundation of our scripture for today. The second part comes from our first reading, which is from Zechariah. And Zechariah is talking about how the reign of God enters into a city. And it's a ruler coming in on a colt, on a foal of a donkey. It isn't even a donkey. So it's humility below humility. It's not a conqueror coming in on a war horse, but it's a gentle sort of entrance. But Zechariah does not dismiss this as some sort of easy way, because this ruler entering on a colt can drive away the strongest war chariot. So imagine the power of that. And this is once again reminding us of the transforming power of love. We hear this story often at Palm Sunday, when Jesus' entry into Jerusalem, and the words are taken from that. In fact, the words of Matthew have been used in art. When we see paintings from the Renaissance and medieval times, we see Matthew's words where he's trying to capture this metaphor that Zechariah is using of a donkey, the foal, a colt, the foal of a donkey. So he uses both words, and they'll paint two animals. They paint Jesus on a donkey, and then usually right next to him there's a little colt, or sometimes right under the donkey there's a colt. But Zechariah was trying to really emphasize the humility and gentleness of the reign of God and the power behind it. And so this enduring vision, this purpose of a ruler being able to come into a city and transform it, that is fortitude. It's not fear, but purpose. Which brings us to our gospel readings. And in our gospel readings, we encounter Jesus, and he has a crowd of people, and he's frustrated, and he says, "What do I compare you to? You know, I compare you to children in the marketplace." And ancient children in the marketplace are not a good metaphor. We might be thinking of sweet little Victorian children playing in the corner, or maybe a family out shopping and going to the farmer's market. Ancient children in the marketplace are not good for anything. They're not honoring their families. They're not with their families. They're not working. They're not in the fields. They're not in the shops. They're not doing what they should be, because there was sort of an expectation of children being little adults. And so they're idle. They're not doing anything. And on top of that, they're criticizing, because they said, "We sang our dirges and you didn't mourn. We played our pipes and you didn't dance." Well, of course, nobody's going to mourn at a dirge, because it's not a funeral. It's not real. It's not authentic. The same thing, too, with pipes. It's not a real song. It's not a wedding. So they're asking for authentic responses to inauthentic prompts. And this, on top of it, is coming from a group of children who are idle. So it's not a good metaphor. And then Jesus goes further and he says, "You know, John came and he didn't eat, and you said he had a demon. And I come eating and you say I'm a glutton and I hang out with sinners." You can almost hear Jesus referencing some of our social media. Sometimes how we become preoccupied with the Facebook posting, how the tweet pops off the brain onto the screen, becomes something for a day, and then disappears. Inauthenticity, sensationalism, diversion, distraction. This is what Jesus is criticizing. Now, if we are called to be authentic, it means that we are called to do good, to love, but to love authentically, to love for the long haul, to love tomorrow and the day after and the day after and a year later. And this is what Jesus is asking us to do. Now, we are living through a remarkable time right now, a time of COVID and social distancing and isolation. And it's hard. It is very hard. We long to get back to our community gatherings in person. We want to be able to see our loved ones and hug them. We want to be able to go out to a restaurant and eat, or go to a concert or sporting event. We want to be able to see our fellow human beings without a mask. We're tired. I know I am very tired. But what Fortitude teaches us is that we go the distance. We are able to move forward with purpose, with love. It's not fun. It's tiring. I'm reminded of people who run marathons. I've never run a marathon, but I've talked with people who run it, and I've seen quite a few marathons. And people, get tired. Halfway through, their legs are melting, their muscles are burning. They're exhausted, but they keep going and going till finally they reach the end. And some of them in that state of exhaustion just collapse. Others come running and embrace each other. It's really amazing. You see them with those blankets wrapped around them. This is what the end of the scripture is promising. So Jesus tells everyone, all of you who are laboring, come to me, and you will find rest. He said, my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Now, first of all, Jesus is talking in a paradox, because yokes aren't easy. If you've ever seen cattle or oxen in a field yoked, it's not an easy thing. And burdens, by their definition, are not light. But Jesus is talking about once what is done, what has to be done is done, then you can rest. And you can revel in that feeling of accomplished love, that you can enjoy the benefits of your labor, and you know that justice and righteousness and love have been fulfilled. Running that long game, doing what needs to be done to cross the finish line, that's what fortitude is. We think about the creation of Sabbath and the story in Genesis. Can you imagine what would have happened if Creator on day one said, let there be light, and then at the end of day one, whew, that was tough. Boy, that light is hard to make. I'm taking off. I'm done. We would be missing out on the entirety of creation. And so this is the point. After the appropriate amount of time, after the appropriate labor, even God rested. And this is what Jesus is promising at the end of our scripture. That the yoke is easy, the burden is light, even though while we're in the middle of it, it's sometimes unbearable. And this is our purpose. This is what fortitude is about. And this is what we should be aiming for as we go through this really difficult journey of COVID and social distancing. And so when we take time to run the race to the end and have strength of purpose and courage to endure it, we're able to see one another in authenticity and love. We're no longer children in the marketplace, criticizing or finding fault with one another. We're not pretending anymore. We're not engaging in magical thinking that gets us to a perceived end when it only plops us back to the beginning. When we accept God's love and choose to live in love, this is important. We have to choose to live in love. We are transformed. We're purposed. And we can put our hardships on God, and we can share our yokes and our burdens. And together, at the end, once all is accomplished, we can leap like stags. We're no longer dwelling in darkness and sin, but we're upheld by virtue. And that virtue is fortitude. So in this time of crisis, may we look to fortitude. It is a virtue which I highly endorse, and it's a good thing. Peace.